Quite some time ago, I mentioned that I had been reading in 1 Samuel and onward. It's been a long time since I really read that part of the Bible. And I've been impressed with a number of things, one of which is the amazing power of God that was demonstrated to them back then. And so I've entitled this message, Victory is Sure. Why? Is answered in many texts, but I took this from Exodus 14:14. The Lord shall fight for you. I think we know enough about God's power that if God is the one doing the fighting, we know what the outcome will be. So, if they didn't always trust in Him, but sometimes they did. If we trust in Him, the Lord will win the battle. And I believe there's two applications to these stories. In the Old Testament, they are prophecies of things that will happen in the last days. Number one, that there is no sin that you cannot gain the victory over. Why? Because the battle is the Lord's. Amen. And in spite of the fact that several generations have not taken the gospel to the world, it is possible to take the gospel to the world in one generation. And the reason is the Lord shall fight for you. So I want to focus on three different stories. We can't tell all the details, but we assume that you know about these stories. And before we do that, though, any time that they were going to go into battle, they were supposed to announce this. There was more than this, but this was one of the things they were to announce. And it's found in Deuteronomy 20, verses 2 to 4. And it shall be, when ye come nigh unto the battle, that the priest shall approach and speak unto the people, and shall say unto them, Hear, O Israel. Now when it says people, it means the army. Ye approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts faint, fear not, and do not tremble. In other words, don't be scared. Why? Because the Lord will fight for you. Let not your hearts faint, fear not, and do not tremble. Neither be ye terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is He that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Now the ultimate enemy is the devil, and gaining victory over all of our sins, we're battling the devil. Taking the gospel to the world, we're battling the devil. But in spite of that, we have God on our side, and He will fight for you. Now, also it goes on to say, if anybody's scared, you can go home. I wonder what would happen if the United States Army put that into practice. How many would go home? Well, we know that what happened to Gideon, he did not read this to his army because it was too small. He only had 32,000. But he was told in a different method he had to do it. And he came up with 300. Now, I don't know what Gideon was thinking when he only had 300, but I suppose that he was a little nervous about the outcome with 300 against maybe 1 million soldiers. Anyway, he went ahead and victory was given. Now we jump in the first story to the time of Samuel. After Samuel has become the leader of Israel, which really was God's plan. He didn't want them to have kings. he wanted them to be led by prophets. But the people weren't satisfied with being led with a prophet. However, God demonstrated something to them that should have encouraged them. And in 1 Samuel 7, verse 3, "And Samuel spake unto all the house of Israel, saying, If ye do return unto the Lord with all your hearts." Now they had been in terrible captivity to the Philistines. And the Philistines made their life miserable. Here, Samuel points out, why were you held in bondage? Because you were disobeying what God said. So, here's the instruction. Then put away the strange gods and Ashtoreth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, do you think there's going to be a battle within 10 miles of this church in 2 weeks? Absolutely. In fact, the battle will begin when the brochures arrive at their homes. And they're supposed to arrive after Sunday services. Because if it comes before Sunday services, their pastors will add to the battle. And they'll warn, that's a Seventh-day Adventist meeting, don't go there. So, the battle is on. Now, our part is the same as Samuel told. Are we wholeheartedly serving him? Are we serving any idols? Because we better get rid of those if we expect God to fight for us. If we expect a different turnout than what we've had before, then we have to make sure we're clean. So Samuel gave them that instruction. They listened, and it worked, just like God said. Verses 10 and 11 of 1 Samuel 7. "And as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel." So the Philistines said, wait a minute, there's too many people gathered in one place. We better take care of them before this thing grows any bigger. But the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day upon the Philistines and discomfited them. And they were smitten before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and smote them. Now, when God sends thunder, he often sends lightning as well. And so this scared that whole army to death. The only thing they could think about was running. And so they were headed for home. But the Israelite army charged after them and wiped out a large number of them. The next story we look at is found in 1 Samuel 14, verses 6 and 7. "And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised." Now, because God had given circumcision to the Israelites, they called the other nations uncircumcised. Well, the background to this is that, again, the Philistines had gotten the upper hand. They had gotten it to where the Israelites hardly had any weapons at all. And the best army that Saul could get together was 600 men. That's all. And so the rest were in hiding, and they were scared to death. And so Jonathan says to his armor bearer, maybe God could use us. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Now, is that what you would do in those circumstances? To set up an army of 2 and expect to win against the Philistines? And his armor-bearer said unto him, Do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee, behold, I am with thee, according to thy heart. He had the right armor-bearer. The armor-bearer said, Sure, with God's blessing, 2 of us can do it. But they wanted to be sure that God was in it. So in verses 8 to 10 we read, Then said Jonathan, Behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. Now they were climbing up this mountainside, and so they proposed that before they go any farther up the mountain, that they would step where they could be seen, because the Philistines are on top of the mountain. If they say thus unto us, Tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and will not go up unto them. So if the enemy says, You wait right there, then they would wait until the enemy came down, because you can fight them easier on a mountain. They can't get too many of them. But if they say thus, Come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. So they set up the sign to make sure they knew the Lord's will in this, and sure enough, the Lord gave them the sign to climb up. So, in verses 13 and 14, And Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet. It's pretty steep. He had to go on all fours. And his armor-bearer after him. And they, that's the Philistines, fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer slew after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor-bearer made was about 20 men. So here the Philistines are waiting for them to get to the top. They got the advantage. They're on top of the mountain. And these 2 followers of Jesus get up to the top and kill 20 of them. Incredible. Why was it? God said he would fight for them. But that wasn't all that happened. In verses 15 and 16 it says, Then panic struck the whole army. Maybe 500,000 men, 1 million men. And out of that slaughter of 20 men, they all panicked. Those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties. And the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. That was from the New International Version. It was a little clearer. And the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude, that is the army, melted away. It was just disappearing. And they went on beating down one another. And so Saul with his 600 men, he said, What? This is incredible. And so he decided to go into battle and do what he could. Patriarchs and Prophets 6:23 gives a few more details. Angels of heaven shielded Jonathan and his attendant. So when they got to the top of that mountain, the angels were protecting them. They didn't even get hurt, and they killed 20 men. Angels fought by their side, and the Philistines fell before them. The earth trembled as though a great multitude with horsemen and chariots were approaching. So this was not thunder from heaven, but there was such a shaking of the earth and noise that sounded like this incredibly big army that was approaching the Philistines. And of course it was the army of heaven. Jonathan recognized the tokens of divine aid, And even the Philistines knew that God was working for the deliverance of Israel. You know, as time went by and the heathen nations watched what happened to Israel, they learned an important lesson. They said, if the children of Israel are obedient, you better leave them alone. If they are disobedient, you can attack. They learned that lesson. But it seems like Israel didn't learn the lesson. And they kept going into apostasy. And they kept worshiping idols and doing the things that God said don't do. Because they were slow learners. But the heathen were faster learners. And so all of a sudden they realized, uh-oh, there's been a change in Israel and their God is fighting for them. We better get out of here. Great fear seized upon the host, both in the field and in the garrison. In the confusion, mistaking their own soldiers for enemies, the Philistines began to slay one another. So they got so scared they couldn't even tell who was their soldier. Now, I don't know whether they dressed, in a certain uniform like we do today. But then, of course, maybe there were infiltrators that they were worried about too. I don't know. I'm sure that idea isn't just a brand new idea, to infiltrate the army and wear the soldier's army that belongs to the enemy. But anyway, they got so scared, they just started killing each other right and left. I found this in a youth instructor article of November 24, 1898. This daring work sent a panic through the camp. There lay the dead bodies of 20 men. And to the sight of the enemy, there seemed hundreds of men prepared for war. Now, who were they? Angels. The armies of heaven were revealed to the opposing host of the Philistines. So only 2 men came up to the top of the mountain, but as the Philistine army looked over there, it looked like thousands of soldiers were up top of the mountain and headed their way. So we read the end of it in chapter 14, verses 19, 20, and 23. And it came to pass, while Saul talked unto the priest, that the noise that was in the host of the Philistines went on and increased. And Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves, and they came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a great discomfiture. So the Lord saved Israel that day. So they did some, but most of it they didn't even have to do. By the time they got there, the Philistine army was mostly dead already. Now we go to the third story. Everyone knows about David and Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, 26 and 33. Here was David's comment after who knows how long this Goliath was announcing, the Israelite army was on one hill and the Philistine army was on the other hill, and they had decided on a challenge rather than trying to fight with their whole army. And so the announcement was, send a man to fight me. If I win, you'll be our slaves. If you win, we'll be your slaves. I'm sure that was a lie. If Israel's individual had won a normal way, which wasn't the case, but if they had won a normal way, then their army would have come after Israel and still tried to keep from being slaves. That's the way the devil works. He lies all the time. But anyway, That was the challenge. And so David came along from watching the sheep, and he was seeing this going on. And so finally they took him to Saul, and he said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Wouldn't you like to have a picture of Saul's face when that was said? Probably, he didn't want to say something bad to David, but he probably thought, really? You mean, you think you can take him on? Now, by the way, Goliath was about 10 feet tall. He was a huge man and proportionately wide. In Deuteronomy, and think around the second or third chapter, it describes the bed of some of those giants that Israel had to fight. And so we know they were 9 to 10 feet tall. So and Saul said to David, thou art not able to go up against the Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth. What experience do you have, David, in fighting in a war? You're just going to be slaughtered out there. But David had a reply from verses 34 through 37. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them. Why? Seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me, so he's not taking credit for killing the lion and the bear. He knows that God gave him the victory. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. So he gives two reasons to Saul that Saul couldn't argue with. Number one, God has promised to deliver. Number two, he is defying the God of heaven and the people that serve him. And so he's finished. When he gets to that position where he can defy the people of the true God, he's finished. Well, Saul let him go out there after he tried to help him with armor, and David got rid of that. He went out. And verses 42 to 44, and when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. Goliath thought, who do these Israelites think they are, sending a kid out here to fight me? And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? So he must have had his shepherd's rod with him. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. So he was very sure of victory. But notice what David said. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth, not with sword and spear. And he gives his reason, for the battle is the Lord's. So as we move into our evangelism, the battle is not ours. The battle is the Lord's. And he wants to reach the honest-hearted people in this area. And the battle is his, not ours. We need to do what we can, but we need to understand the battle is his. Now, it's interesting that David's promise was bigger than the Philistines' promise. All he promised was to get David and feed him to the birds. But David said, not only can I defeat you, but the whole Philistine army is going to be fed to the birds. Patriarchs and Prophets 6:48 says, there was a ring of fearlessness in his tone, a look of triumph and rejoicing upon his fair countenance. Where did he get that from? Holy Spirit was inspiring his reply. This speech, given in a clear musical voice, rang out on the air and was distinctly heard by the listening thousands marshaled for war. Now just think about this for a minute. The Israelite army heard this. I'm sure they were thinking, he's crazy. There's no way that's going to happen. And the Philistine army heard him. And they said, he just is deluded to thinking he can bring that about. The anger of Goliath was roused to the very highest heat. In his rage, he pushed up the helmet that protected his forehead. Now just also stop a minute and think how impossible it was for David to win over Goliath. I mean, all he had was a sling and a stick. And Goliath was fully covered with armor. There was no way. David was totally dependent on God for some method of killing this guy. And here, God made Goliath so mad that he removed part of his protection himself. Isn't that amazing? He removed it himself. In 1 Samuel 17:51 to 53, and when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So they knew, if they catch us, we're going to be slaves. And so they were headed out of there. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted. So all of a sudden, the whole army got courage and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharim, even unto Gath, and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. Tremendous victory. These three areas were all controlled by the Philistines, but they didn't dare stay there. The Israelite army was on their trail, and so they were killing as they went, and finally they pushed them far enough, killed enough of them. They went back to where their camp had been, and in those days they took all their wealth with them. I don't know what in the world they would do that for, but they took their wealth with them, and so they got all their their wealth from their tents. Patriarchs and Prophets 6:48 says, this is when the stone took him down, amazement spread along the lines of the two armies. They had been confident that David would be slain. So the Israelite army was already thinking, oh no, we're going to be slaves again to the Philistines. The Philistines were smitten with terror, and the confusion which ensued resulted in a precipitate retreat. In other words, they had no plan for retreat. There were no orders to retreat. Nobody could think. All they could do was run in total disarray. And that left them a total sitting duck for the Israelite army. And there was no reason for the terror other than that Goliath had been slain, but there was this supernatural terror that fell upon the army. Why? Because the Lord said that he would fight for them. Again, the lesson we are to have from all this is that there is no sin that we cannot have victory over, if we recognize that God is willing to fight the battle. Also, there is no reason why we cannot finish the gospel into all the world. Even with COVID restrictions and all the rest that we have, there is no reason why we cannot conquer the world for Christ. He has given us a message just as surely as he gave to the Israelites. Others have part of the message, and some have precious little of it, but we have it all. And not to say we can't learn more, we can, but God has given us the message to take to the world, and we don't have to be afraid of anything. Whatever it is, we don't have to be afraid. And so let's put our full trust in God and believe and work as hard as, if we believe the victory will be ours, then we're going to work hard too, right? We're going to do everything we can to make it a success. And so may God bless us as we move in through the next 2 weeks until these meetings begin.